They said the greatest swimmer of all time had gone soft, that the fire had died, that at 31 years old, Michael Phelps was just another aging champion chasing ghosts of glory past. And then Shad Clos made the mistake that would haunt him forever. Minutes before the 200-meter butterfly final at the Rio Olympics, the South African did something no one had dared to do in Phelps's prime. He danced, right there in the ready room, shadowboxing, bouncing on his toes, throwing playful jabs toward the man who had once owned this event like no one in history. Clos grinned, swayed his hips, made a show of it all. The cameras caught everything. The other swimmers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But Phelps? Phelps just sat there, stone-faced, eyes forward, jaw clenched so tight you could see the muscle working beneath the skin. That stare became iconic within seconds. Dark, cold, absolute. It was the look of a predator that had just been reminded why it hunted in the first place. What Clos didn't understand in that moment, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that he had just activated something far more dangerous than an athlete. He had awakened a mentality forged in 2 decades of obsessive preparation, shaped by a psychological architecture so precise that failure was not a possibility, but a mathematical impossibility. This wasn't just about a race anymore. This was about respect. This was about legacy. This was about proving that greatness doesn't fade when it's built on foundations deeper than physical ability alone. Rio de Janeiro, August 9, 2016. The Olympic Aquatics Stadium held 15,000 spectators, but the tension in that arena could have filled twice that space. This was the 200-meter butterfly, Phelps's signature event, the race he had dominated since the 2001 World Championships when he was just 15 years old. He had won this event at Athens 2004, Beijing 2008, and London 2012. 3 consecutive Olympic golds. But London had been 4 years ago, and in the swimming world, 4 years might as well be a lifetime. Phelps had retired after 2012, walked away from the sport entirely, fallen into a dark period of depression and self-destruction that nearly cost him everything. By 2014, he was arrested for DUI, suspended from USA Swimming, banned from the World Championships. The comeback that followed wasn't driven by the need for more medals. It was driven by the need to prove he could still control his own mind. Bob Bowman had trained Phelps since he was 11 years old. Their relationship transcended coach and athlete. Bowman understood that Phelps' greatest weapon was never his 6'7" wingspan or his size 14 feet or his double-jointed ankles. It was his mental capacity to execute under pressure, to visualize every possible scenario and prepare for it with frightening precision. But that weapon had been dormant, rusted, and now, facing a ready room full of hungry competitors who believed the legend was finished, Phelps had to prove that the sharpest blade doesn't dull with time if it's properly maintained. Shad Clos wasn't just any competitor. He was the man who had beaten Phelps in this very event 4 years earlier in London, touching the wall 0.05 of a second faster, to claim gold while Phelps took silver. That loss had stung in ways few understood. It was one of only 2 individual Olympic races Phelps had ever lost after making a final. Clos had every right to be confident. At 24 years old, he was in his athletic prime. He had won the world title in 2013. He was hungry, talented, and convinced he could repeat his London performance. So when he danced in the ready room, it wasn't entirely arrogance. It was strategy, psychological warfare. Get inside Phelps's head. Make him doubt. Make him angry. Make him anything other than calm. But Clos had miscalculated catastrophically. Because anger wasn't Phelps' weakness. It was his fuel. And the mental training Phelps had undergone during his comeback wasn't about suppressing emotion. It was about channeling it with surgical precision into every stroke, every breath, every turn. Sports psychologist Michael Gervais had worked with Phelps extensively, teaching him mindfulness techniques, visualization protocols, and emotional regulation strategies that transformed reactive anger into focused intensity. Phelps didn't need to respond to Clos' taunts with words or gestures. His response would come in the water, where it always had, where language didn't matter and only execution counted. The Ready Room incident spread across social media within minutes. The image of Phelps's death stare became a meme, a symbol, a warning. Analysts debated whether Clos had made a tactical error or a masterstroke. Some argued that getting into Phelps's head could rattle him, throw off his rhythm, make him overthink. Others recognized what that stare actually meant. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even anger in the conventional sense. It was certainty. The absolute, unwavering certainty of a man who had already won the race in his mind 1,000 times before his body ever touched the water. Do you remember the first time you watched Phelps swim and realized you were witnessing something that transcended normal human ability? If you're watching this because you understand what it means to see greatness operate at levels others can't even comprehend, hit that subscribe button. This is where we break down the moments that separate legends from everyone else. The athletes walked out to the pool deck. 50 meters of pristine water stretched before them, lane ropes cutting perfect boundaries between destinies. Phelps was in lane 4, Clos in lane 5, right next to each other. The symmetry was almost poetic. The two men who had defined this rivalry, side by side, with the entire world watching to see if the king could reclaim his throne, or if the new champion would prove London was no fluke. Hungary's Tamás Kalisz was in lane 3, Japan's Masato Sakai in lane 6. Dangerous competitors all, but everyone knew this race was about two men and the psychological battle that had been building for 4 years. Phelps stepped up to the block. His routine was precise, unchanged from 1,000 races before. 3 arm swings, a deep breath, the subtle roll of his shoulders that loosened the muscles across his back. But something was different this time. His face held no expression whatsoever. No nerves, no excitement, nothing. It was the face of a machine running a program it had executed so many times that deviation was impossible. Bowman had drilled into him that emotions were data, not distractions. Feel them, acknowledge them, use them. The anger from Clos' disrespect was there, but it wasn't controlling Phelps. He was controlling it, directing it into the explosive power he would need off the blocks, into the relentless rhythm he would need to maintain through 200 meters of butterfly, one of the most physically demanding races in swimming. The beep sounded. 8 bodies launched into the water with violent precision. Phelps's entry was textbook perfect, his underwater dolphin kicks carrying him further than anyone else before he surfaced. The first 50 meters were critical in butterfly. Go out too fast and you die in the final 50. Go out too slow and you give away too much ground to make up. Phelps hit the first turn in 26.5 seconds, Clos right with him at 26.6. The South African was swimming the race of his life, matching Phelps stroke for stroke, clearly believing he could repeat his London miracle. But this was where Phelps's preparation revealed itself in ways the cameras couldn't fully capture. Bowman had spent months working on pacing strategy, studying the biomechanics of Phelps's stroke under fatigue, identifying the exact moments where technique breakdown typically occurred, and building specific strength protocols to prevent it. They had analyzed video of the London race frame by frame, identifying where Phelps had lost rhythm in the third 50, where his breathing pattern had shifted slightly, where the micro-adjustments that cost him gold had occurred. This time, there would be no micro-adjustments. This time, there would be no weakness. The second 50 meters are where butterfly races are won or lost. The lactate builds, the shoulders burn, the breathing becomes labored. Lesser swimmers start to shorten their strokes, their hips drop, their kicks weaken. Phelps had trained for this exact sensation, had pushed his body to the edge of collapse so many times in practice that racing pain felt almost comfortable. At the 100-meter turn, Phelps was still ahead, 55.5 seconds to Clos, 55.8. 0.3 of a second. Nothing. A margin that could evaporate in a single stroke. Clos made his move in the third 50. He had to. This was his Olympic final, his chance to prove London wasn't a fluke, his opportunity to beat the greatest swimmer in history twice. He lengthened his stroke, increased his tempo, closed the gap. At the 150-meter turn, they were virtually even. Phelps, 1:25.2. Clos, 1:25.3. 1/10 of a second separated them with 50 meters to go. The crowd was screaming. The commentators were losing their minds. This was going to come down to who wanted it more, who had trained harder, who could push through the pain when every muscle was screaming to stop. But here's what the cameras didn't show. Here's what the spectators couldn't see. Inside Phelps's mind, there was no panic. There was no doubt. There was only the execution of a plan rehearsed so many times it had become instinct. Bowman had taught him that the final 50 of a 200 butterfly wasn't about strength. It was about rhythm maintenance. It was about keeping the stroke long when your body wanted to shorten it, keeping the kick strong when your legs wanted to die, keeping the breathing pattern consistent when your lungs were burning. Phelps had visualized this exact scenario hundreds of times. Being tied with 50 to go, feeling the fatigue, hearing the crowd, and executing anyway. The final 50 meters of that race will be studied in swimming programs for generations. Phelps didn't sprint. He didn't panic. He simply maintained. Stroke after stroke, breath after breath, his technique remained flawless even as his body was operating at the absolute edge of human capability. His underwater cameras showed his dolphin kicks off the final turn were still powerful, still precise, still generating propulsion when most swimmers were just trying to survive. His stroke count didn't increase, which meant he wasn't shortening his pull. His head position didn't change, which meant his core stability was holding. Every detail that Bowman had obsessed over in training was manifesting in the moment when it mattered most. Clos was giving everything he had. You could see it in the desperation of his strokes, the way his technique was starting to break down, the way his body was fighting against itself. He was fast, incredibly fast, but he was racing against something that transcended speed. He was racing against 2 decades of systematic preparation, against a mind that had been trained to function at peak efficiency under maximum stress, against an athlete who had turned his own comeback from personal disaster into the ultimate motivation. The final 15 meters felt like they took hours. Phelps and Clos were stroke for stroke, the wall approaching with terrifying speed. But in those final strokes, something shifted. Phelps found something extra, some reserve of power that he had saved for exactly this moment. His final stroke was longer, more powerful, more perfectly executed than any that had come before. He lunged for the wall with every ounce of force his exhausted body could generate. The scoreboard flashed. Phelps, 1:53.36. Clos, 1:54.06. 0.7 of a second. In a sport where hundredths matter, 0.7 might as well be a mile. Phelps had won his 4th consecutive Olympic gold in the 200-meter butterfly, a feat that will likely never be repeated. He had answered Clos' pre-race taunts not with words, but with dominance. He had proven that mental fortitude built over 2 decades doesn't evaporate because of retirement, or age, or personal struggles. He had shown the world that greatness isn't about being undefeated. It's about how you respond when you've been knocked down. But the real story wasn't the time on the scoreboard. It was what happened in Phelps' mind during those 2 minutes of racing. Sports scientists who later analyzed his performance noted that his heart rate variability, a key indicator of stress response, remained remarkably stable throughout the race. His cortisol levels, measured before and after, suggested he had processed the pre-race tension as challenge arousal rather than threat arousal, a crucial distinction in performance psychology. His post-race interviews revealed a man who wasn't celebrating beating Clos specifically. He was celebrating the validation of his process, the proof that his comeback training had worked, the confirmation that the mental skills he had rebuilt from scratch were real and effective. Clos would later admit in interviews that his pre-race behavior had been a mistake, that he had underestimated the quiet intensity of a champion who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone except himself. He had thought he was getting inside Phelps's head, but what he had actually done was remind Phelps exactly who he was and what he was capable of when properly motivated. The dance in the ready room hadn't intimidated Phelps. It had focused him with laser precision on the only thing that mattered: execution. The psychology of elite performance is often misunderstood. People think it's about confidence or motivation or wanting it badly enough. But Phelps's career, and especially this race, demonstrated something far more sophisticated. It's about creating a mental framework so robust that external circumstances become irrelevant. Bowman had worked with Phelps on scenario training, deliberately creating high-pressure situations in practice where everything that could go wrong did go wrong, forcing Phelps to adapt and execute anyway. They had practiced with broken equipment, with artificial distractions, with physical discomfort, all designed to make race day feel easy by comparison. This approach paid dividends in Rio. When Clos danced, Phelps didn't need to figure out how to respond because he had already trained his response. Default to the process. Trust the preparation. Execute the plan. Everything else is noise. This isn't motivational poster philosophy. This is cognitive behavioral conditioning applied with scientific precision to athletic performance. Phelps had literally rewired his neural pathways to respond to stress with systematic execution rather than emotional reaction. The broader implications of this race extend beyond swimming. What Phelps demonstrated was that sustained excellence over time isn't about maintaining peak physical condition forever. It's about developing mental skills that can compensate for physical decline, about building systems that outlast raw talent, about understanding yourself so thoroughly that you can perform optimally even when circumstances aren't perfect. At 31, Phelps wasn't the same physical specimen he had been at 23 in Beijing. But mentally, he was far more advanced, far more capable of managing pressure and executing under duress. The image of Phelps's stare in the ready room became one of the defining photos of the Rio Olympics. It captured something essential about competitive greatness. Not joy, not anger, not even determination in the conventional sense, just pure focus. The total absence of anything except the task ahead. Sports photographers called it the most intimidating expression they had ever captured. Psychologists called it the face of flow state preparation. Competitors called it terrifying, because they recognized in that moment that they weren't racing against an athlete. They were racing against a system, a mentality, a level of preparation so complete that the outcome was never really in doubt. If you've ever wondered what separates the truly great from everyone else, this is it. Phelps didn't win because he was more talented than Clos. He won because he had spent 20 years building a mental framework that made losing impossible when he executed correctly. And he had trained himself to execute correctly even under the worst possible circumstances. That's not genetics. That's not luck. That's obsessive, systematic, relentless preparation, meeting the moment it was designed for. Leave a like if this story reminded you why Phelps isn't just a swimmer, but a master of the mental game. Subscribe to this channel because we're going to keep breaking down the moments where psychology met performance and created something that looked like magic but was actually just excellence, refined to its purest form.